happy with your job.
Yeah,
There's a
me
lot
too.
of, it's like
I'm happy with my
day.
change.
Mine too, in case I ever come back to
I
my
stay
desk.
home.
Retirement is a blessing.
Yes, it is.
I was gonna say, you earned
I
it.
told
Call this regular city council meeting to order for July 6th, 2020 at 7:01 PM. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Horn,
Present.
Mr. Bateman,
Present.
Mr. Leith,
present.
Mr. Welch,
Present.
Mr. Parrott,
Present.
Mr. Downs,
Present.
Mr. Keller,
Present.
Mr. Haneke.
Present.
Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I don't believe there's anybody in the lobby or on the phone for public participation. So we will go ahead and move on to the consent agenda. It was payment of bills, and then the approval of minutes, June 9th, 2020, committee of the whole meeting, June 15th, 2020, regular city council meeting, June 23rd, 2020, committee of the whole meeting.
Move to approve as presented.
Second.
Alderman Keller made the motion. Alderwoman Horn, second. Discussion? Okay, roll call, please.
Mrs. Horn,
Yes.
Mr. Bateman,
Yes.
Mr. Leith,
Yes.
Mr. Welch,
Yes.
Mr. Parrott,
Yes.
Mr. Downs,
Yes.
Mr. Keller,
Yes.
Mr. Haneke.
Yes.
Motion passes 8-0. Moving on to bids. The approval of bid from Illinois American Water Company for the purchase of real estate for $30,000 plus cost of improvements.
Move to approve.
Second.
Alderman Hoyke made the motion. Alderman Leith, second. Discussion? Mr. Hoblet.
Doesn't seem to be an ordinance before this council in regards to this. So if voted to pass, I'll have to do one after the fact. And it'll essentially be reflective, and I'll circulate it, but there'll only be 2 additional lines. It'll essentially be similar to the bid ordinance that went out, except that the ordinance will state that only one bid was submitted. That was from the company that submitted it, and for the amount that was submitted. So I believe Illinois American Water with the $30,000. So that's essentially the only differentials that would occur. But I just wanted to make sure the council is aware of it.
Any other discussion? Alderman Bateman. You have your hand up? Okay. Roll call, please.
Mr. Leith,
Yes.
Mr. Welch,
Yes.
Mr. Parrott,
Yes.
Mr. Downs,
Yes.
Mr. Keller,
Yes.
Mr. Haneke,
Yes.
Mrs. Horn,
Yes.
Mr. Bateman.
Yes.
Motion passes 8-0. Moving on to new business. Approval of CSO Improvement Design Contract, Amendment Number 1, for the addition of a bridge design to allow on-access city-owned property to the CSO treatment improvements in an amount not to exceed $60,000.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Alderman Bateman made the motion. Alderman Parrott, second. Discussion? Roll call.
Mr. Parrott,
Yes.
Mr. Downs,
Yes.
Mr. Keller,
Yes.
Mr. Haneke,
Yes.
Mrs. Horn,
Yes.
Mr. Bateman,
Yes.
Mr. Leith,
Yes.
Mr. Welch.
Yes. Motion passes 8-0. Okay, approve of material and force account agreement between the UPRR and the city of Lincoln in an amount not to exceed $219,145 for the construction of a railroad crossing as part of the 5th Street Road project.
Move to approve.
Second.
Alderman Hoyke made the motion. Alderwoman Horn, second. Discussion? Alderman Parrott.
So this is going to take place? When will this take place? Will this take place before we get all the property purchased?
No, no. They will probably start drawing up the agreement once, if the city approves this, they'll start drawing up the agreement. But, I mean, they won't do that yet. But, I mean, they will have it in their mind how they're going to start it, and they will do it after we've purchased all the properties. Then we'll get started. And we should be doing the railroad at the same time that we start this street.
So just a follow-up then. So if we
Mhm.
don't get the properties, let's say, for another few years, this is still the good price?
I think it will be, I hope. I think with this agreement now, we didn't do it back in 2017, and it came up to, 115,000 more. So I think this will hold it in place.
Yeah, so the gist of what we're doing with this is we're getting the price locked in, so by approving this amount, but we will not spend any of this money until all parcels are acquired and the project actually begins.
Yes.
So if the project doesn't begin, let's say it just falls through, whatever reason, are we still locked into to this?
No, we will not do the improvements.
Any other discussion? Roll call.
Mrs. Horn?
Yes.
Mr. Bateman?
No.
Mr. Leith?
Yes.
Mr. Welch?
Yes.
Mr. Parrott?
Yes.
Mr. Downs?
Yes.
Mr. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Haneke?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-1. Item C, approval from the Alibi Saloon to permit the closing of Pulaski Street from Kickapoo Street to Chicago Street on Friday, June 26, 2020, from 7 p.m. until 11 p.m. for band performance.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Alderman Bateman made the motion. Alderwoman Horn second. Discussion. Alderman Bateman.
I just want to say that this was a huge success. I'm glad we're doing it after the fact. It was quite crowded down there, and we should try to work things like this more often for businesses downtown.
I agree. Any other discussion? Roll call.
Mrs. Horn?
Yes.
Mr. Bateman?
Yes.
Mr. Leith?
Yes.
Mr. Welch?
Yes.
Mr. Parrott?
Yes.
Mr. Downs?
Yes.
Mr. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Haneke?
Yes.
Motion passed 8-0. Okay, the next item is the approval of proposal to purchase property at 201 9th Street. City Attorney Hoblet, correct me if I'm wrong, but we are still waiting on a title search to come in on this.
Right, the title search still needs to come in association with that, and there needs to be the appropriate legal description that's put with on an ordinance to essentially acquire. So we're not quite at that stage yet, so it's not exactly prudent to proceed with a vote on this juncture.
So it's on the agenda because when we had our discussion, we came out of executive session and we agreed that we would put it on it. If everything was prepared and ready, we would go ahead and take a vote. Obviously, it's not. So I would ask a member of the council to make a motion to table this item until it is ready.
Make a motion to table item 90 until all the other information is secured for another date.
Second.
Alderman Keller made the motion. Alderwoman Horn second. Any other discussion? Mr. Hoblet.
I'm relatively confident that by the next voting session, we would have that information and hopefully be able to put forth the council.
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Horn?
Yes.
Mr. Bateman?
Yes.
Mr. Leith?
Yes.
Mr. Welch?
Yes.
Mr. Parrott?
Yes.
Mr. Downs?
Yes.
Mr. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Haneke?
Yes.
8-0, the item is tabled. And the last item on the agenda is discussion about the appropriations for FY 2020, 2021. Mr. Treasurer?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You've all received the copy of it that I circulated. There have been revisions of it prior to that based on conversations with the police chiefs and with the department heads. I think it's pretty well self-explanatory. I know, keep in mind, this will be published, or the notice of a public hearing will be published in the Courier on Wednesday, which is July 8th. There'll be a public hearing prior to the next voting meeting, which will be the last voting meeting in July, which will be on July 20th. The public hearing will be at 7, followed by the voting meeting. We can talk about it tonight. We can also talk about it at the committee of the whole meeting on the 14th. I did send a memoranda out with it. Also sent a copy of the memoranda from last year that I thought the city attorney did an excellent job of explaining why we do this and explaining what we do with the appropriation. I want to thank Alderman Hoinaki and Alderman Horn, City Administrator Kavelman for assisting with this, and as always, City Clerk Peggy Bateman for providing a lot of the detailed information that we needed to put this together. I'd be happy to entertain any questions. If you want to focus on certain sections of it, we can. It's not required that we go through it section by section, but if you want to do that, we can do it, or we can focus in on certain sections or certain lines.
Mr. Treasurer, is the item that we've been discussing regarding downtown in here?
No, it is not.
Okay.
It is not, so that would have to be added. Couple of things that I did add, I'm glad you mentioned, in the library parking lot, I've mentioned this before in a previous meeting, we may be required to pay back a portion of that grant money, so I've accommodated that on page 14. And then on page 12, there was a change from the previous printing of this with the sewer work that needs to be done.
So then we'll discuss that item at the cow.
We can, or you can discuss it now if you'd like. It's up. You're talking about the downtown.
It doesn't matter to me. Ms. Kavelman, what would you prefer?
Sure, if you want to talk about it now, we can tell them what we've been talking about.
Quick meeting, so we've got time.
Okay, well, I'll keep this quick too. We've been talking about some of the buildings that we've had, the more distressed buildings, historical buildings, and some other buildings throughout the city that need some help. And some of them have been put up for sale, and finally some of the taxes have been reduced on the property taxes. So at one time we put in some money into a fund, and we used it as an incentive to help individuals get going, especially if they've got a plan in place, something written, some kind of financial, something showing that they have. We're going to do a lot of work on the building, especially if they need to put some structure in or do some foundation work or a roof or something, but to make the property beautiful again, especially these historic buildings that we have. So we kind of formed this little committee or commission. I don't know, we haven't done that yet. It's all up to the council's approval. But there was a realtor in the community that has been working on this with me for a couple months, and we've started putting this together, and we thought, wow, we do have, I'm going to let Mr. Treasurer talk, because we did have, we still have 5 properties, don't we? I mean, 5 businesses that we've been helping through a sales tax deal and helping, and then it's
We have one at this.
one left.
One
We
left,
did have
yeah.
5, yes. And they've been making the city money, but we'd like to get these buildings back on the tax roll. And the individuals who are purchasing these properties have really made a commitment that they're going to renovate them, do some really good things to them, and make them shine again. And we'll have those back on the property tax rolls. And I think it's a win-win. It might not take place for a year or 2, but I think it's going to help. So we're kind of just throwing this around.
Mr. Treasurer.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Madam City Administrator. What this would be similar to the facade grants that we've done. Sometimes we've done them through the TIF fund, which was not the best way to do them. Other times we've done them through the general fund, and these would be done through the general fund. They would be limited at a limit of $7,500. The TIF or the facade grants were limited at $10,000. These would be $7,500, which would and not more than half of the expense. Primarily aimed at structural improvement. Many of these buildings are in the historic district, which would mean anything that's done to the outside has to meet specifications as outlined by the Historic Preservation Commission. But a lot of this could be, and probably would more likely be, structural things to make these buildings viable for the purpose of operating businesses out of them. What we had talked about in this little informal committee or subcommittee, or what you want to call it, which consists of excuse me, Mayor Welch. I almost called you Mayor Goodman. Sorry. Mayor Welch, Alderman Keller, City Administrator Cavalman, and me. And what we had talked about was adding $60,000 to the appropriation for that purpose, with a limit of $7,500 per recipient or per business for the purpose of primarily for upgrading the structural integrity of these buildings so that they can be used to operate a business. Many of these buildings have such low taxes on them now because they're in just terrible shape that they're not usable for businesses. And a lot of this goes back to the previous owners who, in recent years, who did nothing to these buildings to improve them and allowed them to deteriorate. We can't go backward on this. I think the feeling of the committee was if we can do this and get these operating as businesses, the sales tax will go up. They're not going to get a rebate on the sales tax, so the the property tax will go up, and some of that will increase the TIF increment, which we can use then for that. This is not part of the TIF district. This is not in any way tied to the TIF district. The increase in property value would affect the TIF increment if that happens, but you're not going to see any increase in the property value of these. In fact, some of these buildings may show a decrease in the property tax values if something isn't done with them because they're sitting there empty. In many cases, they're continuing to deteriorate. So we thought this would be a good way to, if you want to use the expression, kickstart this some development primarily downtown, but it could be buildings outside of downtown as well that are in bad shape. And did I leave anything out?
I just wanted to add that our city attorney sits on that.
Yes,
as
I'm sorry.
as an advisor, as well as Wes Woodhull, our building inspector,
Yes,
does,
yes.
and two of the realtors.
Thank you. I will point out, so we don't start rumors with this, that the realtors we've been dealing with is not the previous mayor, so I don't want anybody thinking that this was something we've engineered off the books with him. It's not the case. Not that he would do that, but you know how those stories start.
I just wanted to add he did know about that ahead of time. We've been working on it for a couple months, but
Alderman Bateman.
So this is a good idea. It's, mentioned on the 9th Street property. I think we should start selling properties, even if it's, at a very low price, to try to get them back on the tax roll. My question is this. If we're going to budget $60,000 and say only one business comes forward in a fiscal year and it's a cap of 7,500, I would like to entertain some kind of language that as the fiscal year drags on, if no one else is coming forward, that business could then ask for additional funds not to exceed the budgeted amount. Because I'll just say it, we look at it every day. I've seen some of these buildings downtown. 7,500 won't even pay for the engineering costs to figure out what it takes to repair them. So I applaud the $7,500 amount, but that's a drop in the bucket to what some of these buildings actually need. And if we're going to budget that kind of money and make the commitment to spend it, if we can work out some kind of language where toward the end of the fiscal year, that business comes forward and says, hey, you can see the progress I've made, this is what it's actually costing me to fix it. What's the chance of getting more of that money to help me along?
So one thing before I go to you, Jeff, because I want to explain that. Ms. Cavalman and Treasurer Conzo did a very good job of explaining the whole program. I do commend Beth for reaching out and running this down and getting it all organized and getting everybody together. It was her and this other individual's idea, so thank you for bringing it forward. She brought it to me and I said, yeah, let's move forward. It's a great idea. The money, we did have a discussion about the money in detail, And we landed on $7,500 because one of the ideas that we had discussed was that an individual property owner, obviously they might not get all of the work done in a single year. So they could come back for 3 consecutive years and ask for $7,500. If you take that 60,000 and each can get 75, you're essentially helping, 8 businesses, 8 property owners, somewhere along there. And so, 6.
8.
No, 60,000.
7,500.
Yeah, 8. we had multiple discussions about that right there. 6, 8. It was 8, and the idea is that you have 8. If we're lucky, we have 8 in the beginning, right? But the future years, some of those may come back. So if there's extra money available, yeah, the idea is to get it into these buildings to rehabilitate them and get them operational again. But it could run into a situation where a few come back in future years, so it might limit that possibility. So just so you know, let me go to Jeff and I'll come back to you. Alderman Hornicky.
Sure, thank you. I think Alderman Bateman's idea is very well intended, but if you have more than 1 or 2 or 3, do you do like a lottery April 15th before our fiscal year is over? You know, what I'm saying is, how do you divvy up the rest of the money if you have more than 1, and they all want a piece of the pie of what's left over? I mean, you have to put something like that maybe in there.
Alderman Bateman.
Well, I mean, they would come forward and ask. We would reach, if you have 3, we would reach out to all 3 and say, we have
Whatever
left. Can you put together a plan and ask us why you should get additional money? And then, which I think's a great idea. The faster we can get these businesses up and running, and maybe it's a cash flow problem why it would take years, where if we could eliminate some of the cash flow problem. And then to answer Mr. Welch's scenario, you could put a cap on it. Say it's $7,500 not to exceed 30,000. So I'm just throwing numbers out there, but you could say, or go 3 times that amount. It's $7,500 with a maximum amount of, this amount. And at that point, those scenarios have played out against each other. And, I just think if we're going to commit 60,000, we should commit the whole 60,000 and just spend it to get these businesses back up and running. And some of you that, Jeff knows full well, because his son owns 2 of those properties. They're in need of a lot of repair, and $7,500 isn't going to go very far. Maybe this kind of incentive would just as you guys say, kickstart the person going, okay, well, the committed $7,500, but I could actually get this if I qualify and come forward with a solid business plan on how to do it.
City Administrator.
Yes, hi. I did want to mention that we're going to be, our committee or commission, whoever is on this, that we would really scrutinize these applications. And it's going to be a application pretty extensive, based on pretty much like the facade grant application. And individuals would have to fill this out, and I also would have to have all of their taxes paid up, their property taxes, those kind of things, before they applied. And then if, I had said, but I don't know if this is what the rest of the commission wanted, but if they had a lot of extensive work that they were going to do, or they were just going to devote the full time getting this done and come back, maybe they would get a little more than the $7,500 up front. But that is just what I was thinking, but we don't have to do that. But the other thing is, it's a good way for anybody to do this. It's anybody on the multiple listing, or anyone that's got a property for sale that wants to come approach this commission and say, I've got a property for sale, and I've for a business in the downtown or anywhere in the city is a business. They can come forward, but it's supposed to be to help generate jobs and generate better looking buildings downtown and in the whole city. So.
Alderman Barrett.
Just a couple questions. Has there been any businesses that have already been spoken to in regards to this? And then I think we would need, if it's for the improvement of these dilapidated buildings, then I think we would need to have a list of these buildings that would be approved. Otherwise, it sounds like it could be to any business that wanted to improve their structure, their facade, or whatever across the whole city. And I thought the idea of this, when it was mentioned to begin with, was to improve these buildings that are historic. They're about ready to, not be worth anything. They're going to, fall down. Now it seems like it's kind of branching out a little bit further than that.
We've left this open for the entire city of Lincoln, but our focus right now will be the downtown area. And that's where we'd like to start. But these individuals, we've had 4 individuals who've come forth. One has bought 2 or 3 properties, and they're really working on them. They've got some really good ideas, but they have to show in writing that they're going to do some good things, plus check off what parts they're going to start with in a phase.
Sure, because I think you could probably get the council to be in agreement that these buildings downtown, these historic buildings, we could probably get on board with trying to help with these improvements. But now when we open it back up, and to maybe Kevin's point, if we don't have anybody that has much interest into investing, except for maybe one person who isn't in the downtown area, now we could potentially give them $60,000 to renovate an old 2-story a house for a bed and breakfast. I mean, is that a possibility?
Yeah, so the idea behind it, when this all started, it started because without going into detail for obvious reasons, there are some interested buyers for some of the downtown buildings, but those buildings are in a condition right now where they need some significant work done. When we had these discussions, we knew right away that nothing we could offer would even touch what it's going to take to get these operational and back to a point where a business could come in and occupy it and open up a business for whatever reason, whether that be a bed and breakfast or a retail shop, whatever. The idea was to focus this just on structural components, and we've put a list together that'll be shared in the packet next week. And Wes helped us, based on his expertise in that field, of those structural things that could qualify for that money. So the other part of your question was the other businesses, right? We didn't want this to just become something for downtown, because we have a lot of buildings in this town that are in similar condition and they don't have tenants in them. And so we want to make it possible so that, let's say, some of the businesses or buildings out on the west side that have sat empty because a business closed for whatever reason, maybe they need some work. So this could help get them some of that capital they need to do some of those repairs to make it a functional building again. So the idea was to spread the love, right? There are some other ideas that we're talking about that would potentially help businesses once these buildings become functional. Then it could help the occupants of those buildings. But I don't want to go into detail about it because that's just not ready to be, it's still being vetted. It's not ready for open discussion yet. So does that help a little bit?
Would it also be available to those that had received facade grants to continue to work on their buildings already downtown as well?
But as it stands right now, we haven't funded the facade program. Yeah, it's been a couple years since we funded that.
This would be two.
Mr. Hoblet.
Another consideration for the council moving forward in regards to this will be enforcement provisions, because there is money that the city is contemplating, and essentially investing in these buildings with the idea that they would become successful businesses and therefore recoup some of that money via the increase in the property taxes. So we have to have provisions in place for when the business doesn't do those things. I think the idea that's being promulgated with the group is that this person or these businesses would do some upfront in order to submit their plan, whatever engineering costs, whatever they have to do up front, they have to incur those costs preemptively before, you don't know what's going to happen when you open up a building and, and you see what's in the interior of it. There could be many things that you actually need to improve. You know, once somebody gets in there and takes a look at it, and you're trying to avoid the situation where someone submits a plan that does not take that into contemplation. They open it up and they see there's a little bit more to do, and then they leave. Or the idea that, you know, you give these people this money, you know, to essentially improve their business, and instead they turn around and use it on a mortgage payment. There has to be provisions in place. One, obviously, will state you can't do that, but in the event that they start doing that, or you invest this money and for a number of years afterwards, they're just clearly missing their deadlines, what provisions in place will you have to try to recoup that money that you invested in that business? So that's also something that the council needs to ponder as well.
So along those lines, I'll share what we've discussed as well, was that regardless of the fact that it's tied to the TIF, the facade program was very well set up in the way the guidelines and the way it operated. And so we had discussed in great detail how that would work, what Mr. Hovlet was discussing, and it would be similar to the facade program in that you would apply before you did the work so that we knew what you were going to use the money for. When the work is completed, obviously Mr. Woodhull would do an inspection, or someone else that is determined to do that. And then once the inspection is complete, they would submit their receipts, and then they would receive the maximum amount of money that they were allowed per the program. And I say it like that because what's going to be brought before you guys next week, we're talking about this today because the appropriations lead us into this next discussion about, do you guys want, and gals, do you want to establish this as a commission and get it operational so that then the program can then start to properly vet candidates, you know, look at applications and things of that nature. And then they could in turn provide some of this guidance and these guidelines and better define that and bring it back to the council for final approval. So we're walking into this, you know, in a consistent manner and very intentional so that we do it the right way and it has the best chance for success. It's a great idea. I think we need to move forward on it, but that's kind of what we'll be talking about next week.
Question.
Alderman Honeeke.
Thank you. One more question it would be per physical address, not per individuals or anything. If you had an individual had 5 addresses, it would still just be per address, right? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So more to come on that in the committee of the whole next week. Thanks for having that conversation. I think it will help with next week's conversation as well. Okay.
Mr. Mayor,
Mr. Treasurer.
thank you, Mr. Mayor. If it please the council, we'll add a line for that into the appropriation, and then if you decide for some reason not to do this, of course, you're not obligated to spend it, but if you're going to do it, we need to do that, and I would recommend the subsection that deals with economic development.
It sounds as though you can go ahead and add that line, and then when we have appropriation discussions and vote, then
Which is
if we move forward with it or not.
Subfund 02-3000 is on page 7.
Okay. Okay. I don't have any announcements myself. Does anybody have? Ms. Kavelman?
Real quick, I have a Comcast one that they were adding some 11 new channels. I didn't get an opportunity to talk about this 2 weeks ago, so you're missing behind here a little bit. But they are adding more channels, HD channels, to the Xfinity TV series. Afro HD, Aspire HD, Bet Her HD, Clio HD, NBC Universo HD, Revolt HD, TFC HD, Unimus HD, Unimus Alt HD, Univision HD, Univision Alt HD.
Thank you. Mr. Landers, did you have something?
Yes, just a couple things. We put out a press release this afternoon or this early morning or late morning. Decatur Street will be closed in the 200 block tomorrow. It could to be closed for a couple days. They're putting in a new manhole structure in that street, prior to resurfacing, so that street will be closed down. We did receive the bids for the resurfacing projects and the sidewalk project. Everything come back, the bids come back fairly decent and under budget, so that should be moving forward here shortly. We'll be bringing that to the council, next week in the cow. And then also the welcome signs should be, in place coming up by, the 1st of August sometime. So we'll have those, in place, at 4 different entrances into the city.
Thanks, Walt. Any other announcements? Alderman Parrott.
Just a question, I guess, in regards to the outside eating for our businesses, and I'm glad that they were able to take advantage of it, and that it's gone, really well. I see people eating out there during the arcade, and all that type of stuff. And so, is there a way that we can get in touch? Is that going to continue for how long? I'm not for sure. I thought we had 30 days originally until things open back up, but I'm not for sure if the committee decided to extend it. I think we may have mentioned it. I'm not 100% sure. And then also, is there a way, because some of these fences are just kind of falling over and it looks pretty dilapidated. I mean, it doesn't look good. Is there a way to kind of keep up on the businesses that are letting these orange fences just kind of fall over and whatever? Because that doesn't look good.
Alderman Bateman.
Yes, the city clerk and myself drive around and we notice these things, and we discussed it this weekend about getting hold of some of the businesses that have the fences that's falling down, and she has been contacting businesses during the day to see, are you still continuing? Do you want us to come pick up the picnic tables and such? So she has taken the lead on that, on keeping in touch with businesses. But yes, we need to get with some of them about their fencing concerns.
Ms. Bateman.
Heather called today from Flossie's, and she's said she's not going to need the picnic tables. So the street department knows to pick. They've got something going on first thing in the morning, but they're going to pick up her 2 tables. One of her tables belongs to the park district, and so her stuff will be coming down. Jim Drew called from Sorrento's, and he wants us to pick up 2 of the tables, but he'd like to leave the 1, and that'll free up a couple parking spots. But other than that, everybody I've reached out to would like to hold on to them a little longer. So I guess you'll have to eventually come up with a time frame before the snow falls to get that picked up.
Alderman Bateman.
So that brings up the next point. As everybody knows, I work in Springfield. A lot of people work in Springfield. Springfield has a very successful outdoor seating. They call them parklets at several businesses downtown. And Mr. Welch and myself were visiting with a business just last week. The treasurer was there. And they actually would like us to start having some kind of conversation about doing this permanently during the summer. They would, they offered, same as downtown, there would be a monetary investment on their part to take up the whatever space we determine for them to use to have outdoor seating. I haven't talked to Cindy at Alibi, but I think, that one's always full when you drive by, so I think it's a popular thing. So that to jump on the comment of what Mrs. Bateman said, a lot of these businesses like the idea, and I think, if you go downtown and you talk to the patrons like the idea of sitting outside some of these places that don't have them. So at one point, I would like the city to start that conversation of whether we would allow this for a couple places downtown, because they are very interested. I believe Springfield, if you read the article, they came up with what the popular one that Tracy was showing was in front of Moldener's. They came up with an average of what parking cost for them spots. So since we have free parking, we could just come up with what we think monetarily those businesses would pay to use a couple parking spots.
Mr. Hoblet.
I would just ask that when you're doing your research with these Springfield businesses, I guess just it'd be relevant to inquire to them their insurance. If they're utilizing these parklets outside, are they covered through their insurance company for liability? Because I'm thinking that'd be something that the city would be obviously be interested in regards to liability, and obviously those businesses themselves that might help out as well.
Yeah, I think this is actually a great idea. These things do run a few $1,000s, and it's just going to come down to, if we have that discussion, whether businesses want to make the investment, permitting, hours and the months that they can be out there, just things of that nature. But I've said this quite often, and many of us probably have during this pandemic, is that this caused us to think in different ways to accomplish the things we needed to. And for downtown businesses, the outdoor seating has been a great idea. Now we're at a point where we need to tidy up the fences a little bit and have that discussion. But I think this is another way that businesses can grow their business, and then it beautifies the downtown. It just makes it more attractive. Alderman Keller.
Thank you, Mayor. I love the idea because I think all of us know when you go to small towns or any town when there's outdoor seating that just has more of a community feel. I think it's fantastic. My only concern or question would be, I know that there are obviously parking spaces that are taken to benefit restaurants. Is that at the expense of a non-restaurant business? And in other words, if someone is going downtown and they see parking spaces are taken, of course, by the outdoor seating, so there's a limited amount of parking spaces, but those are all taken by cars. Fine, I'm not going to stop now. I'm not going to I'm going to go on. So I don't want to be a detriment to a business downtown that's not a restaurant by parking spaces being taken. So I don't know if there's any conversations that have been had with non-restaurant type businesses.
Kevin, have you had any?
Quite a few, because of pigs and swigs and such. But I see what you're saying, Ron, but coming from the other side of the block during that whole parking wars, if you want to call it, between the city and the county, every time that came up, there was never a shortage of parking spaces. You know, someone would call and say they're taking up all the spaces, and we'd immediately send someone out to the windows at the courthouse and count 15 available around the square. I understand what you're saying. Most small towns, you have to walk a little bit, but these businesses want to rent the parking spaces in front of their business. And I don't know where the conversation's going. I don't think, it needs to be 3 or 4 like we did with the outdoor seating, but, I think a couple spaces we could consider. Again, I just would like to have this conversation, and maybe get further down the road into the fall and early winter that when if we come to a consensus, then that gives the business in time to invest in what they're going to put out there. Another prominent business owner downtown thinks it's a great idea. We talked about as Walt put up the concrete barricade, for safety purposes. If you research these on the interwebs, there's concrete embankments or heavy embankments that are designed to deflect a car off, but they're also really nice looking. They got flower boxes on top of them and such, so you could still have the safety and beautify the downtown at the same time. So I just think this is a conversation we should start having. Maybe each one of us reach out to businesses and see what they think. But I do know of 2 that really like the idea.
Alderman Parrott.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, I think this is a great idea. I love it. I think whatever it would be placed out there, I think that the city council should approve whatever goes out there because we want it to make sure that it's to a quality, and to an expectation of what we would hope the beautification of the downtown would be necessarily. And that doesn't mean that they can't have perhaps their own sense of style for the type of restaurant and all that type of thing. I'm not saying that, but I wouldn't want to see, some wooden skids out there or whatever, and the orange fence any longer.
Correct. And that's why Tracy brought that up. That's the kind of thing we're talking about there. A nice looking fence that's obviously portable, more of a beautification while adding outdoor square footage to their business. So I agree. I would not be in favor of hurricane fence strapped to a pole like we have now. Obviously, that was an emergency, think on the fly type thing. But if we are going to do this, we would do it in such a way that it would enhance the downtown area, much like the reached out to the county board on a suggestion. Daughter came up from Southern Illinois, went outside that first weekend, had 3 suggestions. 2 of them were realistic, or one of them was realistic. 2 of them were a little off the wall there, but nice music to listen to while you're sitting outside. I reached out to the county board, and the result is what you hear out there now, which I think is a big plus. Once businesses close downtown, it makes it more of the feel that we're all looking for in the downtown area.
Yeah, I see these parklets as somewhat of an extension of the facade of that building, but obviously historic preservation, that committee would have to take a look at these as well. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities, but something we can do, something we should pursue. So, more to come on that. Any other announcements this evening? Ms. Cavalman?
Just real quick, I just wanted to ask if anyone else would like to tour what we were talking about. Let me know, because we've got openings the next 2 weeks. Not next Tuesday. We've got that filled, but we've got Monday the 20th of July and then the 28th of July. If someone wants to do it, go on a tour.
I'll do the 20th.
What was the time on those again?
4 p.m.
How long do those last?
About 6:15. Very extensive, very impressive.
What were the dates again?
Monday the 20th or Tuesday the 28th, both of them at 4 o'clock. I have to give them a list so they check with the corporate office.
Okay. Anything else? Mr. Bateman?
Why were they picked on nights of city council meetings? I just looked down. I know what night I signed up for. That's a city council meeting. And then the 20th is a city council meeting.
That's me. So, yeah, the idea was to be conscious of everybody's evening and give yourself an evening where you didn't have a council meeting and then the next night was this and it just knocks it all out in one evening. And I know it makes for a rather long evening, especially after work.
But greatly appreciated, though.
Yeah. Sounds like it's a very valuable use of time. So, okay. Anything else on that, Ms. Cavalman? You good? Okay. Okay.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Alderman Keller made the motion. Alderman Parrott, second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Meeting is adjourned at 7:50 p.m.